The following program is part one of 2 parts. Each part is an hour long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time part 2, and other lectures in the series will be shown.
We have sort of a combination of things that we want to do today. Lynn and I are going to tag team teach the class. And we want to give you some basic information about entomology. And then we're going to do some fun things at the very end. We're going to show you some actual insects and kind of quiz you on the spot, see if you can figure out some of these things on your own. Before I get started, though, let me talk to you about a few references that you need to know about as you go back to your individual counties. Generally, you're going to want to refer to the UC materials that you've been given in the class. You've got the Master Gardener Handbook, you've got the chapters that you have in the binders or in your folder. You also have the Pests of the Landscape, Trees and Shrubs, which some of you just got today and some of you got before, and the Pests of the Small Farm. Those should be your primary resources. If you want, especially for identification, they've got great pictures in them, so you don't even have to read the words. If you start looking at pictures, you'll be in good shape. Also, you want to refer to the pest notes. Whenever you can, and you're looking for control, we're not going to talk too much about control today, but when you want to start talking to clientele about control, use those pest notes. Another great resource is looking at UC IPM on the World Wide Web and using the internet. The one thing you have to be very careful of is just getting on the internet and starting to look up insect or pest management advice. Because really, as master gardeners, you are only supposed to be discussing research-based material, information that we know is true, based on work that we've done at the University of California or it's been reviewed by some of our peers. So you don't, just because you find something from some little website, it doesn't mean that it's naturally going to be right. So you need to be really cautious about what's out there on the web. There are a lot of other universities that have a lot of wonderful information as well. Take a look at that. Before you ever refer to any of that, though, you want to make sure you always run it through your advisor. And in fact, I have to give credit to a couple sources that I used on my presentation here. Certainly UCIPM for the great photographs that they have. And then also University of Illinois had some wonderful websites. Okay, let's see, that was it. Oh, and then my other caveat is be very careful when you're looking at some of the other pest management references that you see. One of the most popular ones that master gardeners have in all of their libraries is the Ortho Problem Solver. Right, veterans? You love that book, right? It can be really, really a disaster in diagnostics because it covers the whole country. And so you have to look very, very carefully and make sure you're not saying that we have a pest that only occurs in southern Florida. So be careful if you use some of these other references. The other thing about insects that you need to realize too is that pictures aren't always definitive. Believe it or not, color and size are not the overriding factors that we use to identify insects. Sometimes it's as complicated as counting segments on their little feet or looking at their wings and counting the veins. So don't just look at a picture, match it up, and be certain that that's what it is. So that's just a little caveat. Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. We want to cover these topics today. We're just going to talk very quickly about what are insects. I'll talk a little bit about anatomy. I get all the technical details, and I'm leaving Lynn the fun stuff at the bottom. I'll talk a little bit about growth and development, insect feeding. Then Lynn's going to talk to you about classification of insects. And we'll wrap it up by looking at some common pests and some beneficials. We're talking about a very, very large group of animals that insects are a subclass of. These are arthropods, and arthropods are distinctive in that they have segmented bodies, they have an exoskeleton, and a variety of other characteristics. And what I'm going to tell you here is really a lot of general information. It's the bare minimum that you need to know. There's probably about 10 other little elements to each of these things, but you don't need to know all of those details. Some of these things get mistaken for insects, though, and you've probably run into some of these before. We've got The chylopods up here, these are centipedes. Often we run into these out in the garden. These have elongated, flattened bodies of about 14 to 20 segments, and on each segment there's a pair of legs. So what's the key there? A lot of legs. Crustaceans. We run into a variety of crustaceans when we're eating. What crustaceans do we eat? Shrimp, crabs, a lot of different crustaceans, but we also see them out in the yard too. Little sow bugs, our little friends, roly-poly bugs, those are crustaceans also. Crustaceans have 5 to 7 pairs of legs, 2 body regions, and 2 pairs of antennae. And if you look at those little sow bugs up close, you'll see those the 4 little antennae on them. And a very large and important group among the beneficials, and occasionally on pests as well, are the arachnids. The arachnids, of course, are the spiders, ticks, and the mites. Arachnids are distinctive in that they have 4 pairs of legs, right? 8 legs, 2 body regions, and no antennae. And we distinguish that from our big group that we talk about today, the insects. Insects in the adult stage will always have these characteristics. They have 3 body regions, a head, thorax, and an abdomen, which we'll show you. 3 pairs of jointed legs, 1 pair of antennae, and wings. They may or they may not. They may have 1 pair or they may have 2 pair. And often that's what we use to characterize insects. Now, one thing that you need to understand about these very definite things that they have is sometimes these can be highly modified. And what may look to you like a head and a thorax and an abdomen on one insect may be very, very modified if you look at an insect like a scale or even a flea. They have special adaptations depending on their environment. Another thing you need to understand about insects is that they're cold-blooded. Cold-blooded insects. What does that mean? The ambient temperature is the temperature of their body. So if they're in a cold environment, they're cold. If they're in a hot area, they're hot. And temperature influences their rate of growth and activity. Now, this is very important as we start looking at some of our pests and we want to know how rapidly the pest problem is growing. If you have a codling moth, for example, we rely greatly on information with temperatures on how fast the insect is developing. To know how fast it's going to go from an egg to an adult moth or how many days it's going to be a larvae and will do damage is very dependent on temperatures. In general, what we can say is that development is more rapid when temperatures are warm and that their rate of growth is more rapid when temperatures are warm. But keep in mind that there are probably extremes on both ends. So if it gets too hot, you're going to have problems or death. One other piece of information, I knew you didn't have a lot of desk space to write, so most of my information is included in the chapter in the handbook, so you shouldn't have to jot down a ton of notes on these things. Let's go over some of the anatomy again. It's real simple. This is the easiest part. You have the abdomen, the large area, the thorax, and the head. And this, of course, is a lady beetle, ladybird beetle. If we look at a little more complicated, look at some more parts of the anatomy. Covering the abdomen, we have wings, and they're actually attached up here onto the thorax. And the wings can take a variety of different forms. This happens to be a beetle, so they have very hardened forewings or front wings, and then underneath there is a pair of transparent wings that is much softer in texture. Have you noticed that as you see little ladybugs flying around? You see the little hard shell wings, but then underneath are the fluttery transparent wings. Then on the head, you can see that we've got the antennae. You can just barely see the eyes, some mouth parts. And those are all on the head, obviously, just like us. Well, maybe not antennae for most of us, but. And then attached to the thorax, we have the legs. And so you're always going to see the 3 legs on each side. So what, 6 legs, and they're attached to the thorax. You don't see legs on the abdomen, ever. You have to look at that very carefully. That'll tell you the body parts. You can see that the legs are segmented on this insect. You've got 1, 2, 3, then you get down to all these different little segments down here. These are called just tarsomeres. They're part of their little feet, really. And in fact, we use those when we're keying out beetles. You actually count the number of segments on there. Often on other insects, you'll count the number of segments on the antennae, or you'll describe the antennae. If it's got beads on the end of it, a beaded antennae, or does it have a large club? How long is the antennae? We've all seen some of the beetles that have very, very long antennae that go all the way over the back of their bodies. Talk a little bit about the way insects grow. They grow by shedding their outer skin. One thing that I mentioned about arthropods is that they have this hard outer skin, an exoskeleton. The difference between vertebrates and invertebrates, right? We have a skeleton inside of us that holds up our frame. Insects do not. They have this hard, chitinous outer shell to them. And obviously, if you have a hard outer shell, it doesn't make it very easy to grow, because you have to figure out a way to get out of that shell. So what they do is molt, and they will grow a little bit and then shed their skin. And with each molting, they typically change in both size and in appearance. All insects begin as eggs. Now, you may not always see the eggs, and in fact, some insects, the egg stage hatches within the female's bodies, so they may be born as a little nymph. An aphid is a perfect example of that, but they all begin as an egg. And we have these two different types of metamorphosis, and actually there's even some gradual differences in some other ones as well. With gradual metamorphosis, you start out with eggs, and then you have these younger stages that really look very much like the adult, but they're smaller. We call these immature stages nymphs. So sometimes you'll hear us talk about nymphs and larvae. If it's nymphs, that means that they've gone through this gradual metamorphosis. They don't look worm-like. They don't look very different. They look a lot like the adult. Those are nymphs. Leafhoppers, grasshoppers, termites, true bugs all have this type of metamorphosis. The main difference that you notice between these, besides being smaller, is that they don't have wings. Only the adult stage has wings. But you can see as these go along that as they get a little bit bigger, they start developing little wing pads. And the bigger the wing pads are, the larger they are, the more advanced the growth stage is, the instar. Each of these is an instar, and the closer they are to being an adult. You can see that this is the adult here, and it does have wings. In complete metamorphosis, the larvae are very, very different from the adults. Here, once again, you start as an egg, and then you have a larvae, and usually the larvae is the feeding stage. Then you go to the pupal stage, and the pupae can vary tremendously. Sometimes it can be a hard and brown pupae, or it could be in a silken cocoon. A lot of different characteristics to the pupae. And then, in the final molt, they become the adult, the winged adult. The pupal stage is generally inactive, but if you look very closely at a pupae and it's a little bit warm outside, watch them carefully next time you find some little brown pupae in the ground. And you can see that they do have the insect parts on them that are you can see the segments to the abdomen, you can see that they're in there and they're changing, and you can see them move a little bit. So just to warm them up a little bit, and you can see a little bit of activity in them. The adult stage tends to be the reproductive stage. Very often, with some of these, the adults don't even feed or are not particularly aggressive feeders. This is a good example. In a butterfly or moth, we know that very often the caterpillars or larval stages will consume a lot of plant material. But in fact, the butterfly might just eat a little bit of nectar and not be any kind of a pest problem at all. Very different feeding between the different stages. And examples of insects that do have complete metamorphosis are bees, moths, ants, beetles, mosquitoes, and flies. These tend to be the more advanced of the insects. The more primitive they are, the more simple the metamorphosis is. Does that make sense to everybody? Following? This is just like a lot of old-time stuff from your biology classes, right? Here's just a picture of what gradual metamorphosis might look like with real insects. This happens to be one of the stink bugs, and you can see eggs over there on the far left. You can see some little nymphs in the middle there, all clustered together. They probably just emerged from those eggs. They would get larger and a few more instars, and then you see the adult over on the right. This is what complete metamorphosis looks like, and I threw this in because this is just one of my favorite insects in the whole world. Very beautiful moth, believe it or not, called the western grapeleaf skeletonizer. It occurs primarily in the San Joaquin Valley. Starts out as an egg, just like we said with all of them, and they're clustered in a little clump on a grape leaf. And then these little guys hatch out. You see these little pale, tiny worms. They feed gregariously. You can see they're just lining up there and marching out and feeding. As you get into later instars, they start to develop a little bit more color. Here you see them sort of brown and orange. Then when they get up here to the 5th instar, they're just beautiful, beautiful looking caterpillars, yellow and this kind of lavender and black. The tricky part is the black hairs burn. They have a poison on them. They're irritating. So if they touch you, it's like touching a caterpillar, but you get these welts on your skin. So it's not a bad burn. It's just a little bit unpleasant. But it can be aggravating if you're trying to pick grapes and they're in the grapevines. Then you have the pupal stage that you see here, and the worms have just gone from that instar, from the 5th instar, and they're buried deep within the cocoon. And then they molt to this adult stage of a moth. And that doesn't even look much like a moth, does it? It really almost looks more like a wasp or something. But they're these beautiful metallic green or blue sheen to them, and a black insect. They fly around very slowly, and as most reproductive adults do, these guys are quite busy. Here you can see, and you see them flying around like this. It starts the cycle all over again. They lay eggs, and they're just a very cool insect. They're also a great example of biological control. I have to tell you a quick story. There is a disease, a biological control, a disease that will kill these insects very easily. And there was a researcher at UC Riverside, and he was working for a long time to get this biological control organism spread out and get people to use it. So he went to the chemical companies and tried to get it registered. And nobody was interested in getting it registered because once you spread this biological control, it was going to kill all the insects off. So basically, you're developing a product that puts your own product out of business, right? So no one was interested in doing it. So he followed the laws that they have through the Department of Food and Agriculture that says you can distribute, 10 acres of experimental chemicals of this biological control in the state of California. And he divvied California up into, he'd say, I'm going to treat this one grapevine here, or this one grapevine of Vitis californica vine on the American River, or just every place. And he was sort of like Johnny Appleseed. He spread the disease all over California. It only affects the grape leaf skeletonizer and has really brought these guys under control. They're much, much tougher to find now. Figured he was just going to fight the system and work with biology and try to get the insects under control. So that's why that's my favorite insect. Larvae. I mentioned that the larvae can look very different from the adults, and the larvae can look very different from one another. These top ones, the larvae, those are all worm-type larvae, right? Anybody know what any of those are? What's the one on the left here? What's this one? Anybody know? That's a red hump caterpillar. Everybody better know what this is. Tomato hornworm, our good old buddy. And then here we have one of the woolly bear caterpillars. So those are all moth larvae. But what about the one on the bottom? That's a larvae also. It looks quite different, doesn't it? Very good, very good. It is a ladybird beetle. You'd be surprised how many times I go out to vineyards and people see a bunch of those on the stakes and they want to kill them. So, good. Okay, a little bit more about insect development. Let's talk a little bit about mating. That only is going to occur in the adult stage. So you're never going to see those larvae. You're never going to see the worms mating. Typically, the adults don't have a lot of other function. They mate, they lay eggs, and then they die. Very often you'll see a very shortened lifespan for the adult stage. Males are not always required. In a lot of insect species, we don't even see males, or they're very uncommon. They may not play much of a role at all in propagation of the species. We talk about generations of insects. A generation is from egg to adult. So the length of time that it takes to get from one to another is a generation. So there might be 4 generations a year, which means you could have eggs and then adults, and they lay eggs again, and then you get another generation, and another generation, and another generation. Another term that you'll often hear when we talk about insect development is overwintering. Obviously, these pests have to survive through the winter, and they don't always do it in a certain stage. The cycle doesn't begin each year with an egg. It isn't automatic. In the spring you have an egg, and then you have a larvae and a pupae and an adult. It can vary depending on the species. The grape leaf skeletonizer that I showed you overwinters as a pupae. So then it emerges in the springtime as the adult moth. And there are quite a few different insects that will overwinter in that stage. As you can imagine, a pupae is pretty resistant, a little bit tougher, not quite so delicate as some of those other stages. So it would overwinter as the pupal stage, emerge as an adult in the springtime, then lay eggs, and then that generation starts. So sometimes you have a final generation that kind of stops at the end of the season and then continues into the next year. Okay, any questions on metamorphosis and on development so far? Nothing? This is the quick run through. Insect feeding. Insect feeding, of course, is going to depend on the mouth parts of the insect. And we really have about 3 or 4 or 5 different types of mouth parts that we find on insects. But in general, you could lump them into these 2 categories, sucking insects or chewing insects. One thing that you need to remember too, among the differences between the larvae and the adult, is that they may have very, very different mouth parts than the adult. And very often, larvae will have chewing mouth parts, whereas the adults do not. If you have chewing mouth parts, then obviously you can eat holes, you can eat whole leaves. These would be defoliators, we might call them. If you're internal, if you're inside a leaf or inside a twig, if you're inside a twig, you'd be a borer, but you're still eating, consuming whole chunks of plant material. If you're inside a leaf, inside the 2 layers of a leaf, we call that a leaf miner. And if you only eat a few layers of the leaf, those are called skeletonizers. Just a couple examples here. Obviously, we've got a worm here, and you can see chewing, right? They've chewed holes. This is also chewing damage over on the right. And that is an example of a leaf miner. And all that's happening there is that you've got a little, very, very small larvae that's in between the 2 layers on the leaves, and it's just chewing its way through the tissue on the leaf. And so you get these mines that you see there. One thing that you should do whenever you see mining damage like that, hold it up to the light and look at it carefully and see if the little miner is still in there. You'll see at the very end of one of the little tunnels, you'll often see a little insect or a little shadow of one. If not, what you might often see is a hole, right, where it's emerged and left. If you have sucking mouth parts, really these are piercing sucking mouth parts, we call them. It's simply a probe-like mouth part, a stylet. It's like a needle. They're piercing into a plant, and then they can suck plant material back up into their mouth. There's a lot of variation in different insects and the types of piercing sucking mouth parts that they have. This type of damage is a lot more difficult to distinguish because it takes a lot of different forms. In the simplest form, it's going to be mottling, so they pierce into the leaf and they extract out chlorophyll. So what happens? You get little white spots, little yellow spots, right. But they can be a little bit more complicating too, because they may inject something into the plant. They may cause curling because there's death of some of the tissue. They can cause deformity. And very importantly, a lot of piercing sucking insects can be vectors of plant diseases. You see a couple here. Here's a good example of just exsanguination, extracting out the chlorophyll. That's for leafhopper damage right there. Over here, what is that? Anybody have an idea? Not mealybug. It looks a lot like mealybug. Gets diagnosed as that a lot. That's a good guess. It looks like it. That's a woolly apple aphid on roots. And in its feeding damage, in its damage, it causes these galls. And often we can see galls with some mouth part damage from insects. Then down here on the bottom, anybody know what this is? Just about, it's one of like the top 5 most famous insects in California right now. Glassy winged sharpshooter, yes. This little guy is getting millions and millions of dollars thrown at it because it's a relatively new exotic pest in California. It's been here for 10 years, has been present in Florida for a very long time. Doesn't do very much damage, really. It's not that serious an insect feeder. The problem is that it transmits a bacterial disease that kills grapevines, kills almond trees and alfalfa and a variety of other plants as well. So it's a vector of plant diseases. Through this I think this is the last slide that I wanted to show you. It's a little bit of a quiz. Now, what do we have here? First of all, are either or both of these insects? One is Is this one an insect?
No.
No. What is it? It's an arachnid. Anybody know what kind of arachnid? It's a tick. Very good. Very good. What about this? It's an insect. Why do you say it's an insect?
6 legs.
6 legs. Okay. It's got antennae. See, this guy over here doesn't have any antennae, does he? Okay, it is. And that is a louse. Body lice. And obviously would be very small, very, difficult to see, but often gets mistaken for other little critters.
The insect that extracts the chlorophyll, does that do anything for them?
Does it do anything for them?
For the insect?
Yes.
Is there something that
Yeah.
is advantageous to the insect?
Well, it depends on what they're extracting. It's not particularly the chlorophyll, although the chlorophyll is okay too. But think, if they're extracting go back to your botany class that you had, and they're extracting in that area there where there's all the plant sap, and they're trying to get all the rich plant saps. They're getting carbohydrates primarily. Carbohydrates, some amino acids. You're getting a lot of minerals. Think about, we fertilize plants, right? So they have requirements for a lot of those same things, potassium and phosphorus, so they're extracting that as well. With a lot of the piercing insects, they're having to suck in a lot of fluid too in order to extract as much carbohydrate and nutrients as they need. And that's why with a lot of the piercing insects, like aphids are a perfect example, they wind up excreting honeydew. And really they're just pumping that through them very, very quickly so that they're taking in a lot of liquid, they're extracting in their bodies out what they need, and then they're excreting the sugary honeydew water that's left.
Skeletonizer.
What is a skeletonizer? You know, I meant to put in a skeletonizer slide, and I couldn't find a really good one. There was one in there, but it doesn't really show. With skeletonizers, a lot of times what happens, rather than having, because often it's some of the younger stages of the insects, so they have smaller mouth parts. So they got chewing mouth parts, but they're not big chompers, right? So they're just eating layers off of the leaf. So rather than eating the entire holes, chewing holes, they just take the top off. So you almost see it's like a lacy appearance to a leaf. If they get bigger, a skeletonizer will eat the whole thing, and sometimes you'll just see veins left on a leaf. And they can eat. I've seen grape leaf skeletonizers eat 40 acres of grapes. Just eat every leaf out there. So, but they leave the veins. So.
I would like to again acknowledge a great resource that we have here. We're very fortunate in California to have with UC the statewide integrated pest management project. And the photos that I've inserted into my presentation come from UC IPM and the photographer Jack Kelly Clark. We give him credit. We have an excellent resource with him. And I wanted to, again, emphasize these 2 books that are, you all should be, El Dorado's getting their copy today, and the other counties should have theirs in hand, hopefully. These are great resources, and they really go with the chapter in entomology, as well as the pest notes, which you'll be introduced to a little bit later on. So. Going here, let's see. Okay, for my portion, you should be able to recognize the major taxonomic orders of insects and their key characteristics. To give you examples of the key pests and the beneficials from each order, because one thing I want to impress with you is most insects are not pests. And we will see that in this presentation. And then hopefully this will help you answer the inevitable bug in the jar question that you will get as Master Gardener representatives. I'm sure someone will send in a jar of insects and they'll want to know, what are these and are they pests? And hopefully by the end of today's class you'll have some idea on how to answer that question or get it down to order. And then they'll want to know, how do I kill them? And we're going to focus on the identification part today, and then in 2 weeks we have Mary Lou Flint from the UC IPM program coming to help answer, maybe not how do I kill them, but what is IPM and how do we manage pests? Okay, but the first step in an IPM program is proper identification. Why do you think it's important to be able to properly identify an insect?
Different ways of getting rid of it.
Right. Different ways of getting rid of the pest. You might, so it might be a beneficial, it might not be a pest. Right, that's very good answers. Okay. So again, most insects are not pests. There's over 1 million described species of insects. This is a hugely, the term I want to, let's see, insects are they're very good at evolutionarily at becoming established. There's approximately 20 more million undescribed species of insects. They're highly successful. That's the term I was looking for, successful. There's about 3,500 species in the world that require regular attention. 600 maybe in the world are considered significant pests, and less than 100 are considered major pests. And that would be something like the boll weevil or fire ant as examples. So of the over 1 million described species, less than 1% are pests. I'm going to take you through classification today, and this slide shows you the classification of the common housefly. We start with the phylum Arthropoda, which I hope you're all paying attention to Donna's presentation, because we're going to build on that right now. Arthropods, meaning jointed feet. We're going to focus on the class Insecta, not Mollusca or Chilopoda, Insecta. The housefly, the order is Diptera. It means 2 wings. The taxonomic classification, the names for all the orders make a lot of sense, and they're derived, most of them are derived from the Greek, both Greek and Latin. It seems like the botanical names, a lot of them are derived from Latin, and a lot of the entomological terms for the orders at least are derived from Greek. So both of those answers would be correct. They make sense, and I'm going to explain to you each of the orders where they're derived from, what that means, and how that can help you remember how to identify the insects in that group. So I'm going to take you down to order, and then within orders, I'm not going to go through the families. Usually in orders, there can be many families. Then we go down to genus. That would be like your first name, like Lynn. Species. And the author. So when you see a scientific name of an insect, it's always genus, species, and then the author in parentheses. This is the person who is credited with describing this insect. So we're going to start out with the orders that undergo gradual metamorphosis. This is egg to nymph, going through several instars to adult. And these are the orders included in that all undergo gradual metamorphosis. We're going to start with Thysanura, the silverfish, Dermaptera, earwigs, Orthoptera, grasshoppers, crickets, cockroaches, Isoptera, termites, Thysanoptera, which is thrips, and they're kind of an oddball order. We put them into gradual metamorphosis. They have something in between gradual and complete. A lot of these laws are somewhat flexible. We apply them to the orders, but we see how each insect group has diversified to fill, and they still fill these classifications. Hemiptera, which are the true bugs, and Homopterans. And this is all in the handout that I gave you. Okay, Thysanura, silverfish and firebrides. These are the most primitive, some of the most primitive orders. Thysan is Greek for bristle, and ura, tail, so therefore bristletails. They're wingless insects, and they're identified by these 2 lateral appendages called cerci on the posterior of the abdomen. Here we have the abdomen, and this one, what's called a caudal filament. And they're scaly. They're scaly insects. You might get calls about these. What I tried to do is focus on both the garden and household pest and beneficials within each of these orders. This is many pests are simply nuisance pests. They're not really doing a whole lot of damage, but people don't like to see them around. These particular insects do eat book bindings and their glues, so if you go to your library and your binding's falling apart, you might have a silverfish problem, Thysanura problem. They prefer starchy substances, and moisture is a must for these insects. So you'll find these in damp places, common in our foothill counties, I think. And fire brats like it warmer. They're found in steam pipes and ovens and strange places like that. And again, if anyone has a question, let me know as I go. A difference in color. The first thing, I'm not sure they're silver to whitish in color. We don't use color as a way to identify insects. So they might be different in color. They might. Some insects are different in color at different times of the year, after they've eaten different foods. So we try not to focus on color. I think they're both kind of silvery beige in this particular case. The Dermaptera are next. Order Dermaptera. Derma. We all know what derma means, skin. And then every time you're going to see this, tura is Greek for wings. So all of these orders are describing the wings of the insects. So Dermapterans are so named because the first pair of wings of the two pair, are short and hard, and they cover the second, which are membranous. I don't know if you can see that, but this pair of wings, short and hard, Dermapteran. Earwig is derived from an old superstition about them going into people's ears, entering people's ears. I don't know where that comes from, but it's midwives' tale or something. These are omnivorous insects. They have chewing mouth parts, and they can be, so omnivorous means they eat plants. They can also be beneficial. They can be predators. These cerci back here, these appendages on the end of the abdomen, help you identify whether they're males or females. The curved are males, straightened females. The eggs of earwigs are laid in the soil, and there's a lot of maternal care involved in rearing young, and they're generally nocturnal pests. So if you want to go out and trap earwigs, you should think about doing that at night when they're active. They're nuisance pests and can be beneficial again. Our next order is Orthoptera. Ortho, straight wings. These again are primitive. I'm taking you in an order from primitive to most complex. And that's why I wanted to add the notes. In the manual, you have the orders kind of all jump around. And I think it's more logical progression if we do it this way. It is for me anyhow. These are jumpers and runners. It's a very large order. Includes cockroaches, crickets, grasshoppers, walking sticks, mantids. The cockroaches actually, sometimes there's a change in the taxonomic classification of insects. These historically have been put into the Orthoptera, and I think now they have their own order, the Dictyoptera, but don't let that weigh you down or anything. They're the oldest known, they're orthopterans. They're 200 million years old. They've been around for a long time. They know how to survive. I don't think any of you would probably have a problem recognizing a cockroach. What's really interesting about cockroaches, I think, is that they're very greasy insects. And that makes it difficult for us to use biological control on them. There aren't too many predators that can actually grab on to cockroaches. There's winged and wingless forms. They're very fast runners. Flat body, very long antennae. Another good distinguishing characteristic. The third most common household pest control call. And I will just say that sanitation is key in controlling these insects. You can, roach motels are practically useless. and they need sources of food and water. Also in the Orthoptera, we have the grasshoppers, the katydids, and the crickets. These are, we can recognize these easily by their enlarged femur, the part of their leg that they use for movement to jump. They have chewing mouth parts, and they'll eat almost anything, although they do prefer grains. Locust is simply a term for a migrating grasshopper. Again, of the 600 species in this group, most damage is only done by 5. And so most are not serious pests. They cause problems because of the way they overwinter. They lay their eggs in fall in dry, uncultivated land, rangeland. And then in spring, after wet weather and then a period of drying, the nymphs emerge, and they can be a problem in adjacent gardens to this type of rangeland habitat. So they can move over and start feeding in like your cucurbits. And this is a little katydid nymph right here, and this is the type of damage it does. In stone fruit and peaches, they can be a problem. And then the chewing, this is evidence of the chewing mouth parts. So that type of damage could be due to grasshoppers. Something with a really strong mandible. We're going to leave the Orthoptera now and move to the Isoptera. Iso being equal wings in this group. These are the #1 urban pest, termites. There's over 60,000 jobs per year in California, with an average of about 5 cost per job, and I mean pest control job, of $500. This is a huge industry evolved around controlling this pest. They're destructive. They feed on wood structures and plants. They can also be considered beneficial. In the tropics, they convert dead trees into useful biomass. So both beneficial and a pest. These insects have a social caste system. So they have kings and queens, workers and soldiers. The kings and queens typically are the reproductive individuals in the group. The workers, they just have the job of they're asexual mostly, and and often they are white in color, and they have the job of just feeding the young. And they also have soldiers whose job it is to protect the nest. So they're pretty advanced in this way. They feed on the wood and they regurgitate it, and they feed on it again. They have a protozoan in their gut that allows them to digest cellulose. Cellulose is an incredibly hard material. If you think of wood and so for them to be able to feed on wood, they have this symbiotic relationship with the protozoan. There's 2 major species, the western drywood termite that doesn't form the soil tubes. They live in wood, and they have solid fecal pellets, and I'll show you a slide in a minute. And the subterranean termite, which require regular contact with soil in building their nests, they build tubes. They use the soil to build tubes. They move around through these tubes. So here you can see the different caste individuals in the winged reproductive. And I'm going to show you a slide towards the end of my presentation. The reproductive are winged so that they can disperse and go out and recolonize. It's a survival mechanism, and people confuse sometimes winged ants with winged termites. So I'm going to show you how to distinguish those two at the end of the show when I get to ants. The soldiers, you can see, wow, they're ready to fight. They've got the mandibles, and the workers. The fecal pellets can help you identify species. So if someone brings in, what are these in my house, you can perhaps get an idea if they're a dampwood termite by the smoothness of the fecal pellet. These are hexagonal in shape, the drywoods. And I think carpenter ant is just frass. I think that's what that's showing. And as I said, control includes keeping the wood and soil from the foundation, from touching the foundation. On to the thrips, Thysanoptera, fringe-winged insects. And thrips is always plural. Thrip is never a correct term. And I picked out the 6-spotted thrips, which happens to be a predatory thrips, because you can, in this picture, you can see little tiny hairs, fringes on the wings of the thrips. There's over 8,000 described species, and western flower thrips is probably the most common pest species of thrips for gardeners. As I said, most feed on plants, but some are predaceous. And they have sucking mouthparts. Sometimes thrips are referred to as being raspers. They have these interesting modified mouthparts, but they do suck. They don't really rasp. And sometimes that's because of the damage that they leave, that people think that they're scraping the surface of the plant. Okay, these are incredibly small insects. You definitely need a hand lens to see this insect, at least to see the larvae of this insect, because the larvae don't move as fast as the adults and they're extremely difficult to see. They love pollen. They're common in flowers. They also love, they're thick, so that's anthophilus, that new term for some of you maybe, and thigmotactic. They love tight confined spaces. It makes them an extremely difficult pest to control, especially with pesticides. Thrips are very challenging pests and very serious pests. They get into, they go under, they get into the cracks, the little lateral, buds where the branches are coming out, and they hide. And you often can't get them with contact insecticides. They lay their eggs inside leaf tissue, and the larvae feed on plant tissue, then they pupate. The pupate are often in the soil, so that's another difficulty in controlling thrips, because you may have done a good job of spraying your plants, but if the pupae are in the soil, they're going to emerge as adults and another generation is going to come. Have people seen thrips before? People know what thrips are? Well, you might have seen thrips damage, especially this on flowers, this kind of white damage on flowers. That's thrips feeding damage. Silvery sheen can indicate on plants, can indicate thrips damage. They also have a watery feces, and black sooty mold can be a problem associated with thrips. So sometimes you might get a sample and just have an indication of thrips damage, but you might not see the actual insect. They also transmit this very serious virus, tomato spotted wilt virus. It's got a range of symptoms: stunting, mosaic mottling, vein clearing. And this particular virus has a huge host range: gerberas, peppers, tomatoes, pansies, or I think petunias maybe. It's got a huge host range and a lot of different symptoms associated with. And so thrips is a vector. It carries the virus, and the virus is transmitted to the plant when the thrips feed through their feeding. And you can see here in this gerbera, this one's infected with tomato spotted wilt virus. It's stunted, heavily stunted. Beneficial thrips. There are many beneficial thrips. Not all thrips are bad. In fact, that's kind of my take-home message for you today. Not all insects are bad, and even if there are insect pests in the order, often there are many beneficials in that order as well. These are just some of the beneficial thrips. You can see they range in color. This is the black hunter's thrips. common in ornamentals in some areas. These are banded wing thrips. This is an immature stage of a Franklinothrips, which is a predaceous in avocados, very prevalent in avocados. And there was I had an opportunity to work in avocados on a new pest in avocados called avocado thrips. And that came up, we think it came up from Mexico. And we found in the avocado groves in Ventura County an abundance of this predator once this pest showed up. And this is a six-spotted thrips. And I think six-spotted thrips are available commercially.
Can I make a comment about thrips?
Yes.
We had commented when we wanted to do this that we were going to, this is the first time we've taught together, so we were going to kind of watch each other and pitch in when we had different ideas. And I have a couple thrips hints because I work with them quite a bit. First of all, it is hard to see them on the leaf with your little hand lens, so what I tell people to do, let me borrow your paper here, if you suspect you've got thrips, and take your plant material. Sometimes I'll see them on irises or in flowers. I see them in grapes all the time. Take your plant material and tap it on a piece of paper. White works okay, pale blue's the best. Your t-shirt works in a pinch. And then you can see them in better contrast. You knock them out of those little places and you can see them running around. The western flower thrips a lot of times will look like little orange specks, little elongated like little cigars kind of running around. So sometimes that sort of helps to find them. The other problem, though, in trying to find them is a lot of them like it early in the season when it's a little bit cool. So about the time that you see the damage, their populations have already crashed because the hot weather has come in and they're gone. So a lot of times you'll see the damage after the insect is already gone. So that's my little thrips hint.
Thank you. We're gonna, the next order is the hemipterans. These are the true bugs. Hemi standing for half of a wing, and that refers to the fact that the front wings usually have the basal portion thickened and the distal portion membranous. And this is a box elder bug, and you can almost see that this part is thickened and this part down here is membranous. It's really hard to find pictures of insects with their wings, with them in flight. You almost always find photos with them folded at rest. So it's much easier to see some of these wing characteristics if they've got them there in flight. But
why are they called true bugs?
Because because people call just about any insect a bug, and in fact, it's just a common name for an insect. So this order of insects has been named the true bugs because they're because they are they're the true bugs, and you can tell in the nomenclature. You can tell when by the name if it's a true bug, the bug part of the name will be separated. But all of these insects here are hemipterans, and as characteristics of their order, they're called the true bugs. And you can identify them both by their hemielytra, which is their half-hardened wings, first pair of wings, and the scutellum is this little part of the triangle right here on the thoracic, on the segment. The thoracic segment is prominent, and that's a real key feature for hemipterans. That little triangle that you'll see on their back. They have piercing sucking mouth parts, and they come from the front of the head. That's to distinguish them from a lot of the other homopterans, where their beak arises from sort of the back of the head. These are just taxonomic characters. And you can get a reaction from their feeding. They can inject a toxin while they're feeding. They're very diverse group. We have bed bugs in this category, which are bloodsuckers, plant suckers such as ligas, and predators as well, minute pirate bugs, many predators. Many are opportunistic. They'll get whatever they can. They'll be predaceous or they'll feed on plants. And they almost all overwinter as adults. This gives them a huge advantage in spring because they come out and This is typical of Lygus, and they can do early season damage because they come out already as adults. So they're really robust insects. The most important genus in this group is considered to be Lygus. Lygus attacks cotton, beans, alfalfa, strawberries. Here again you can see that very prominent scutellum. You can almost see the membranous part of the wing there. And here's a nymph. Here are the nymphs. And we distinguish, all these, the gradual metamorphosis is distinguished by external development of the wing pads. And approximately 9% total losses in the state. So this is a significant pest in California. They're seed feeders, Lygus are, and their feeding causes distortion. Cat facing in strawberries is caused by Lygus. And these types of depression in pears, they have a large host range, again, caused by Lygus. In cotton and seed alfalfa, their feeding can cause the flowers to drop, so they can actually decrease yield of the crop. Beneficial hemiptera, we have a lot of them, and they're beautiful. Damsel bugs, minute pirate bugs, big-eyed bugs, assassin bugs, these are all beneficial hemipterans. Most of these are generalist predators, if not all. When something's a generalist, when we term something a generalist predator, it means it doesn't have a specific host that it goes through. Some beneficial insects require a specific host. They feed on a specific host or oviposit in a specific host. Generalists feed on often any soft-bodied insect that they can get their mouth parts into. They can be cannibalistic. They can feed on each other in some cases. Many also feed on pollen and nectar. Some are difficult to mass rear. So some of these predators, and by that mass rearing I mean that the availability of beneficial insects from insectaries where they can actually rear the insect. It's like an insect farm. But some of these, like minute pirate bug, are very difficult to rear. This is the assassin bug. This is the minute pirate bug. It's very easy to distinguish by its black and white crisscross on the back. This is a nabbit, a damsel bug. And this is a big-eyed bug, so named for its bulging eyes. These are all adults here.
The preceding program was part 1 of 2 parts, each part an hour long. There is support material available at this website, including quizzes, handouts, and lecture outlines for all presentations. Consult the UCTV programming guide for the date and time part 2, and other lectures in the series will be shown.
It's the definitive guide to gardening, produced by the University of California. The California Master Gardener Handbook contains over 700 pages of in-depth information on topics such as soil, fertilizer and water management, plant propagation, weeds and pests, lawn care, landscape design,